welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya and today we bring you news from Israel where the government has fallen into a minority. The 75th World Health Assembly is going to start in Geneva, the first to be held in person since the pandemic. And in Colombia, a historic election is all set to take place in 10 days. We go to Israel first, where lawmaker Renave Zoabe of the left-wing Meretz resigned from the coalition on Thursday, citing, in her words, disgraceful harassment of Arabs. The Naftali Bennett government is now in a 59-61 minority. The opposition, led by Likud, may move a proposal next week to dissolve the government and hold fresh elections. Zoabi has listed repeated and intensified skirmishes between Israeli forces and Palestinians as her reason. Abdul from People's Dispatch will tell us more about this. Abdul, is the Bennett government's fall into minority status a surprise?
No, I don't think it is surprising. It was expected. Last month, we had a discussion over how one of the right-wing members of his coalition, Silman, resigned. The reasons are opposite, completely two diverse reasons. You see, she resigned because she complained that the Bennett government is not right enough. Zoabi's resignation is the government is not progressive enough as it was promised when the coalition was formed. As we know, Bennett's coalition is a kind of rainbow coalition which has left-wing, right-wing, Arab parties for the first time. So it was expected to be, as she was claiming, to be a kind of adopting a more moderate stance vis-a-vis Palestinians and the two-state solution, which it has not, even the treatment of Arabs within Israel. So all those things have not materialized. We have seen how different kinds of atrocities have increased in the last few months. For its own reason, of course. Bennett has its right-wing constituency and it wants to kind of make it more consolidated. So that is quite obvious. So Meretz, the party she belongs to, going with such kind of policies, it is surprising enough. Labour, we understand, Labour has an history. But when it comes to Meretz, it's a surprising thing that they had not done anything about it. I think the killing of Akla, which happened last week, is you can say the breaking point, which ultimately it had to happen. So it is not surprising.
You mean the journalist who was slain?
Yeah. The Palestinian journalist, Al Jazeera journalist, who was killed last week by the Israeli forces, is, you can say, is the breaking point. And I think more Arab members will take some or other position similar to this. So it is not surprising.
All right. You know, she has cited a number of reasons, and the primary one is that the way the Israeli forces and the Israeli state has behaved towards the Arabs. Could you tell us a little more about what this behavior is?
Exactly. The primary reason she cited is, apart from other things, the killing of Al Jazeera journalist. We know that yesterday itself, Israeli state decided not to even investigate who is responsible and how that killing happened, which, though it hardly makes any difference, we know, but for even the formality's sake, the Israeli state has refused to investigate her killing. Apart from that, she has cited the incidents of Al-Aqsa, repeated attempts to barge in, repeated barging in, attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque, the forced displacement in Negev, in Masafariyata. So Masafariyata is still in occupied territories, Negev is in Israel. And she is a MP representing the Arab constituencies, of course. And then the attacks and the arrests of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, which has increased primarily after the Palestinian prisoners escaped from Israeli jail last year. She has also cited other similar incidents, and one of the major incident is basically, which has been cited, is how the promises made when the coalition was formalized, that the laws related to Arabs in Israel one of the primary reasons cited was the so-called citizenship law, which basically prohibits all the couples living together who are married across the borders of across the Green Line. The Arabs marrying Palestinians in the occupied territories will not be able to live together because of this passing of this law. Apart from that, other atrocities committed against the Palestinian and Arab citizens of Israel. So all these things has increased instead of going down, given the fact that this is for the first time that Arab party has come with right-wing Zionist party. It was expected that this such kind of oppressive mechanisms against the Arab minorities and against the occupied Palestinians will reduce. But it has increased, as I said before, because there is a policy, there is an intent behind it, and the intent is to consolidate Bennett's own constituency, which is hardcore right-wing constituency.
Yeah. All right, Abdul, thanks very much for that update. The World Health Assembly is scheduled from 22nd May in Geneva, Switzerland. It will be held in person after a 2-year break due to restrictions during the pandemic. Health for Peace and Peace for Health is the theme of this year's assembly. The pandemic has revealed the shortcomings of national healthcare systems and the heavy toll of this neglect on ordinary people and the ability of the WHO as well to solve some of these problems. As shortages in food, medicine, education, livelihood and security plague many countries across the world, the WHO is now proposing a new healthcare architecture. Anna from the People's Health Movement told us a short while ago why this assembly matters.
Anna, welcome to the show. Anna, what is a World Health Assembly and why is this edition of the assembly significant?
Well, the World Health Assembly is the governing body of the World Health Organization. It meets once a year, every year in Geneva in May. And so it's important because it's actually the only place, the only WHO governing body where all member states take part. So you have countries like the US and the UK, but they're on equal grounds as Costa Rica and the other countries that come from the global south. That's why the World Health Assembly is so important, because it basically provides the ground for places in the global south to to basically share what they think it's important to address in global health governance and to push for a different direction that we have been seeing lately.
So, Anna, one of the things we all saw very starkly during the pandemic was the lack of cooperation between the South and the North, between countries. It was absolutely in a shambles and people paid the price for that. So are there going to be any solutions, any possible outcomes in that direction from this assembly?
Of course, always the agenda of the World Health Assembly is very packed. So, if we're not talking about World Health Assemblies, which have special sessions like the one we had last November and which focused on a pandemic treaty, a regular World Health Assembly will discuss everything ranging from non-communicable diseases over polio measures, or issues regarding WHO governance, but they will also talk about health emergency, how the WHO behaves in health emergencies, and also, of course, about the finances of the WHO. And so maybe for finding out what's going to happen in entirety at the World Health Assembly, people might want to follow up with the work of the WHO Watch Team, which is currently in Geneva. They're going to be reporting directly from the World Health Assembly next week. But here we can maybe mention two things. One is building up on something that actually we already touched upon in People's Health Dispatch, and that's about a new approach, not a completely new approach, but about moderate improvements to how the WHO is being financed. And so we have seen that a WHO working group has finally come up with the proposal for member states countries to increase their assessed contributions, which make up a very important part of the WHO financing, because they are untied funds. They give the WHO the space and the room to do what the organization feels it needs to be done, and it's not dictated what different sponsors and financiers think it's important to do. Of course, this improvement suggested by the working group still has its limitations, and I think it's important also to consider those a bit, because they basically suggested that the member states increase their assessed contributions by 50% over a period of time, which is very long. Actually, it's about 7 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. So, and this amount, it's actually not as high as previous suggestions wanted the increase to go. So more would be needed for the WHO to actually meet what it wants to do.
Anna, what were really the roadblocks to trying and achieve greater cooperation? Was it purely a funding problem? Were there other issues?
Well, if we talk about in general, the agenda of the WHO is set by the executive board, but how things play out in practice, it depends a lot also on the power relations between the countries. So, if we look back at one of the points that I mentioned that are going to come up during the World Health Assembly, which is taking place next week, it has to do with the Global Health for Peace initiative. And this is an initiative that the WHO has been driving since 2019. And the main point would be to increase efforts for peace building and for mainstreaming this approach in different parts of global health work. But now what we are seeing, and what's a bit of an issue on this agenda, is that the work plan that the WHO is suggesting for implementing this initiative, it's actually not, well, we can say it's not bold enough. It's not very basically elaborated. It's very general, and it leaves a lot of the issues unanswered. For example, this initiative does very little to address what's happening with health workers who have been targeted by oppressive governments because they do health work. Mm-hmm. So, for example, recently, a nurse from Palestine, Shada Ode, she was sentenced to 16 months in prison, basically because she was providing healthcare to the Palestinian people. And this is something that an initiative by the WHO and WHO itself should definitely address. Right. So there is room for improvement there. Another point where there should be some kind of improvement in this initiative is definitely the field of sanctions, because it does very little to address the impact that economic sanctions have on health of people in countries which fall under these regimes. Mm-hmm. Although we know that the effects are really, really bad. So anything that the WHO does in the future should actually give more thought to problems like this.
All right, Anna, thank you. Thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
In Colombia, left-wing candidate Gustavo Petro is leading in the presidential election scheduled on 29th May. If Petro succeeds, Colombia is on the brink of a historic breakthrough. His will be the first victory for a left-wing presidential candidate in Colombia. Colombia has a hard-right government led by Iván Duque with close ties with the United States. Poverty and inequality are widespread in the country. Petro himself was targeted by the right wing in his years as mayor and before. We speak to Zoe from People's Dispatch about the significance of these elections.
Zoe, thanks for joining us. Can you begin by telling us what the climate looks like now, 1 week out before the election?
Well, this is a historic election in Colombia. We've spoken about it before on this show and on all of our places on People's Dispatch. And tensions are high. There's a lot of mobilization happening. There's a lot of rallies that are happening for the respective candidates. But at the same time, there's a lot of tensions, as I said. There's allegations of fraud. There's a lot of irregularities that have been happening. Leading up to these elections, there's also been an increase in violence against community organizers, community leaders. There's been several assassinations of indigenous activists. So it's a very difficult situation. As we spoke a couple weeks ago as well, there was an armed strike by paramilitary groups following the extradition of a drug trafficking leader. So it is very challenging. This makes a difficult situation for people to safely go out and vote. However, there is a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement for the progressive ticket. There's a lot of excitement for what this possibly could hold for the future of Colombia. So it's a very interesting moment. People are going out to these rallies in hundreds and thousands. They're being held in cities and towns across the country, and it's a really electric moment. However, it cannot be understated, this underlying threat of violence that's always there in the pre-election period, and that many different people have been targeted.
Zoe, there have been concerns raised by human rights groups as well in the run-up. Can you talk about these in detail?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there was been assassinations of different leaders, some of them who are directly tied to the campaign, others who are just social leaders who work with human rights organizations, perhaps in the right to land. But then specifically about the electoral process, there's been several irregularities. An elected official in Medellin, the mayor, he was suspended for posting a video on his Twitter feed that the Inspector General alleged was in support of the campaign of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez. However, progressives have denounced this not only because it is illegal and goes against the American Convention of the Organization of American States, but also they have been raising a lot of concerns about people from the far right committing these sort of infractions, and even worse. President Duque has in several times made allusions to supporting the campaign of Federico Gutierrez, who's a far-right candidate. Many other people have been supporting his campaign in ways that have seemed against norms and regulations. And so there's a lot of this back and forth of electoral infractions. But at the same time, as we saw in the March elections, there are serious concerns of actually electoral fraud taking place on the day of elections. In the March elections, there were hundreds of thousands of votes that were disqualified, and the legal team of the Progressive Alliance, the Historic Pact, had to go to cities and towns across the country to actually recover these votes. And it was hundreds of thousands of votes that were disqualified illegally. And so many people have raised concerns over a similar thing happening in these upcoming presidential elections. And so this has given, again, this climate of tension, this uncertainty of whether the democratic process will be respected in Colombia, as in the past 6 decades during the armed conflict, it's always been a time of increased violence, increased tension, and really concerns over the human rights of the candidates. Also to mention that Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez have themselves received death threats from paramilitary groups. Gustavo Petro now is going to all of the rallies with shields, with bodyguards, which really speaks to the gravity of the situation.
Right. Can you tell us something about the implications if Petro does come to power? What happens then? What does it mean for the politics?
So this is a great question. The region would be extremely impacted by a progressive victory, or also by the re-election of a far-right government in Colombia. Colombia is the US's strategic ally in the region. It plays an extremely important role, not only because of its resource wealth. It is one of the most oil-rich, mineral-rich countries in South America, but also its location right in the top of the continent, sitting on both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, means it's a strategic area for drug trafficking, for keeping control over the region, which in the past several years, many of the governments are progressive. Colombia has historically been a strategic ally in the US's fight against Venezuela. The Colombian territory is used for the training of paramilitaries that have gone to carry out destabilization missions in Venezuela. And so this is key on a regional level. There's so much more to say there. But within Colombia, if a progressive candidate were elected, this will be the first time in Colombia's recent history that a member of the ruling class is not elected president. It would mean that for the first time, the voices of the people would be heard in the executive branch. There are many proposals that Francia Marquez and Petro have brought to the table: energy sovereignty, increasing agricultural production in Colombia. Colombia's peasantry is one of the most oppressed sectors in the country that has historically been excluded, not only from political life, of course, but also economically and socially. And so all of these aspects and issues are on the table right now with these elections. People have very high hopes precisely because of this, because of the importance that it could have, because of the impact that it could have on Colombian civil society, on Colombian politics, but on the politics of the region and the hemisphere as a whole.
Right, Zoe, thanks a lot. That's definitely an election very, very crucial for the region and the country. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that is all we have for today. Do come back to us tomorrow. And for more from around the world, please read peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.